Well, we know that this fire at the synagogue in Melbourne southeast has certainly created a heightened amount of concern amongst the Australian Jewish community. Of course, we know that the motive of that fire is still under investigation by police, but the Prime Minister has said that this is clearly an act of anti-Semitism. We have heard from the opposition in the last little while from the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, James Paterson. Now, he has certainly ramped up the coalition's criticism of the government in regards to their response to this incident, but also to the response to anti-Semitism more generally in Australia. He says that this attack is one of the worst attacks against the Australian Jewish community that has ever been recorded. And he says that the Prime Minister has some very serious questions to answer. One of those is whether or not the National Security Committee of Cabinet has been convened following this fire. But also he says that this incident needs to be declared an act of terrorism. Here's what he had to say.
Why has he and his government so far refused to categorise this act as an act of terrorism? Certainly the Australian Jewish community feels like this was an act of terrorism. They feel terrorised. They feel like this was an act of terror. And it is very difficult to understand what else we should call two men in the middle of the night seeking to set on fire a synagogue while there were Jews praying inside as anything other than an act of terrorism. But if the Prime Minister is in possession of information that leads him to a different conclusion, then he should stand up today and he should explain why he thinks this is not an act of terror.
Now, also, James Paterson says that the opposition has requested a briefing from the Australian Federal Police following that incident in Melbourne, but he says that that request for that briefing hasn't been accepted by the federal government at this stage.
And Monte, this incident is also getting some international attention. We've heard from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. What's he had to say about it?
Yes, certainly these comments from Israel's Prime Minister overnight have certainly created a bit of a buzz here in Canberra. We have seen him link this Melbourne synagogue fire to Australia's vote at the United Nations earlier this week. Now, we saw, of course, Australia vote with 156 other countries around the world demanding Israel rapidly end its occupation of the Palestinian territories. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu says that this attack in Melbourne is impossible to separate from what he calls an extreme anti-Israel position held by the Labor government here in Australia. The opposition, through James Paterson, says that the relationship between Australia and Israel has been trashed by Labor. But this morning we have seen senior members of the government out reaffirming the relationship between the two countries. We saw Federal Cabinet Minister Murray Watt say that he respectfully disagrees with those comments by the Israeli Prime Minister. Also, we heard from Mark Butler, the Health Minister. He says that he is very proud of the relationship between Australia and Israel. Here's what he had to say.
This firebombing of the synagogue is only the most recent of a long chain of anti-Semitic acts that have been happening here in Australia that I and other members of the government have called out. I will point out that our Prime Minister spoke with the Israeli President Herzog, yesterday, and they had a very productive discussion about the shared values we have to combat this appalling rise in anti-Semitism. We've already got a range of things that we've been doing since the 7th of October attacks.
In response to this criticism from the opposition, the government says that their position and the Australian position is very clear. There is a zero tolerance approach to anti-Semitism here. So certainly we'll see how the debate continues to unfold.